Welcome everybody to the meeting of the One Seattle Comprehensive Plan Environmental Impact Scoping meeting. I'm going to start. My name is Brennan Staley. I'm with the Seattle Office of Planning and Community Development. I'm joined by Michael Hubner, who's the project manager for the One Seattle Comprehensive Plan, Patrice Carroll, who is the lead for policy and also is a project manager for 130th and 145th, as well as our consultant team led by Lisa Gruder from Burke Consulting. I'm going to start with just a little bit of meeting information. So first of all, there are a couple different features in the Zoom meeting that you should be aware of. Questions can be answered into the Q&A feature at the bottom at any time. We are going to do a presentation on background and then have a time for Q&A at the end. However, you can submit Q&As at any time. People can answer those if they're simple right away, but then we'll be answering them verbally at the end. Any technical questions you can have can be submitted through the chat feature. I want to note that the chat feature is going to only be visible to the host and panelists. So those are really for things that are technical in nature. While we're doing this meeting, we want to please make sure to be respectful of different viewpoints and experiences. Please avoid using the Q&A to criticize or insult other people. And I want to know this meeting will be recorded and posted on our website so you can people can look at it after the fact. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Michael Hubner to talk a little bit about the Seattle Comprehensive Plan at a high level.
Michael, I think you're muted.
It just told me that. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Excellent. I'll start over again. Good morning, everybody. I'm Michael Hubner. I'm the long-range planning manager in the Office of Planning and Community Development. And Brennan, it looks like you just advanced the slides. If you could go back to the first slide again, please. Thank you. I just want to very briefly place this work that we're doing for the scoping of the comprehensive plan update within the larger effort that the city is undertaking to update our comprehensive plan. This plan is a vision for how we grow and invest in our communities over a 20-year planning period. It's a long-range policy document that guides and informs many areas of action at the city. It is informed by 4 core values: race and social equity, environmental stewardship, community and economic opportunity, and security. And those are really our North Stars and our guideposts as we go forward with this effort. Next slide, please. So a major update of the comprehensive plan is something that first and foremost, the city needs to do under the Growth Management Act, which is a state law which guides and requires this kind of comprehensive planning in cities across the state. Our current plan, Seattle 2035, was completed in 2016, and a new plan is due under the Growth Management Act by the end of 2024. We will plan for growth over the 20 years following that period, so 2024 to 2044. You advanced the slides again. Thank you. Consistent with state and regional policies. And this is not the only thing the city is doing to plan for the future. We're coordinating this effort with other major projects, most notably the Seattle Transportation Plan, which is currently also in a scoping phase of an EIS to plan for transportation across a whole range of modes of transportation over a similar time period into the future, but also work by the departments, Parks and Open Space, Seattle Public Utilities, Shape Our Water Plan, our own industrial maritime strategy here at OPCD, and planning that we are doing and will be doing for a number of years for growth around our light rail expansions led by Sound Transit. So just wanted to place this work in the larger context. And I'm going to turn it back over to Brennan to talk specifically about the EIS process and scoping and the alternatives that we'll describe for you today.
Thank you. So I'm going to start with a little background on the EIS process. So an environmental impact statement is an informational document that provides environmental information to be considered in decision-making. It generally describes existing conditions, proposed actions alternatives, potential impacts that may occur, as well as potential mitigation measures to reduce or eliminate those adverse impacts. And the EIS is focused on identifying and avoiding adverse impacts, but it can also identify potential beneficial outcomes as well. There are generally 4 phases to an EIS. The first is scoping. That is the portion that we're in right now. And that's an opportunity for the public to review and comment on the topics and the alternatives that are proposed to be analyzed as part of the EIS. Our scoping period includes a 30-day comment period that began on June 23rd and goes through July 25th. After the scoping period, we're going to issue a report about what we heard and updated alternatives, and then start the next phase, preparing a draft EIS. So that a draft EIS includes initial analysis of the proposal and the alternatives, and we anticipate that a draft EIS would be published in April of 2023. After it's published, there will be a comment period to solicit feedback on that draft EIS, and then we'll begin the preparation of a final EIS. And that will include updating the draft EIS based both on the comments that we received, but also to add analysis about any changes to the proposal and to add analysis of a final preferred alternative that would be included in the final plan. And so then we anticipate a final EIS would be available in April of 2024, at the same time that the mayor's recommended plan is available and implementing legislation. One of the key aspects of an EIS is that you have to identify and analyze different alternatives. Alternatives are different approaches to meeting the goals of a project that will be analyzed as part of that EIS. Alternatives are meant to be distinct from each other to allow for meaningful comparison. They're meant to represent a range of reasonable options. It's not necessary to consider every option, and it's also not necessary to consider options that don't meet the overall goal of the project. Alternatives should also represent bookends so that the final preferred alternative can fall within that range. You want to study a wide range of options so that it can inform the final alternative, but also such that that final alternative is kind of within the range of things you studied. At the same time that we're updating the comprehensive plan, the Department of Transportation is leading an update of and a creation of the Seattle Transportation Plan. The Seattle Transportation Plan will establish goals, strategies, and recommendations for a transportation system that works for our city now and in the future. They are also required to put together an environmental impact statement, which is very coordinated with the one we're developing for this One Seattle Comprehensive Plan. Overall, the goal is that the One Seattle Plan will hold, as part of our EIS, will hold the transportation network constant and vary the land use to understand the changes of different land use possibilities, while the Seattle Transportation EIS Plan will hold land use constant, looking kind of at the highest amount of growth that we could be expecting, and then vary the transportation network. And so between those two things, we'll have a lot of data on the impacts of both land use and transportation changes. The Seattle Transportation Plan is also in the middle of their scoping period right now. They had a meeting last week, and they are accepting comments as well. So there's a lot more information on both the plan itself and their EIS process on the Seattle Transportation Plan website. So of the number of things that we're looking for feedback on, one is the topics that we're proposing to analyze. Because the comp plan is a major update, we are planning to look at the full range of issues that SEPA suggests should be looking at. So we're not proposing to kind of limit that, and that includes things like earth and water quality, air quality and greenhouse gas emissions, plants and animals, energy and natural resources, noise, land use patterns and urban form, historic resources, relations to plans, policies, and regulations, population employment, housing displacement, transportation, services, and utilities. So a really wide and comprehensive range of things that we're looking at. We've also published draft equity and climate metrics, which are specific metrics that we'd like to analyze to look at those areas in particular. So we can do so people can understand specifically what we're looking at in those areas. In terms of the alternatives that we're proposing and looking for feedback on at this point in the process, in the context of comprehensive plan, the alternatives are different approaches to a growth strategy. And City Council has directed us that we need to look at a minimum of 3 things: allowing new types of housing in neighborhood residential areas citywide. Neighborhood residential areas are those areas that are zoned exclusively for detached homes on large lots. They want to look at expanding access to 15-minute neighborhoods. Those are neighborhoods where you can get a lot of your everyday needs within a 15-minute walk, as well as looking at anti-displacement strategies. Seattle's growth strategy is actually an element of the comprehensive plan currently. It's also the city's vision for how development should unfold over the next 20 years. And it includes both the desired location of new development, but also how city regulations and investments can support and align with that expected development. The current growth strategy we have is called the Urban Village Strategy. It designates urban centers and villages, as well as manufacturing industrial areas where we want to concentrate our job and housing growth. It has been the growth strategy that we've had without major changes since 1994. And again, it concentrates new housing and job in those compact, walkable, mixed-use neighborhoods linked by transits. As you can see on the right is the map that shows where those urban centers, villages are. They're in the blue. It also focuses industrial development in manufacturing industrial centers, and you can see those designated in gray on the map on the right. This strategy has been very effective in concentrating new housing. Over the last 10 years, 83% of new housing has been located in an urban center and village. And so while it has been very successful in kind of helping to create those compact neighborhoods that both allow people to live near shops and services, amenities, and leverage our transit investments, there also are growing concerns about this. One, it reinforces and perpetuates a pattern of segregation and exclusion that has been established in part through racist policies of the past, such as redlining and racial covenants. And it perpetuates that pattern by prohibiting lower cost housing types in much of the city, making it difficult for people to move to those areas. It also has potentially worsened our affordability issues by restricting housing supply and diversity. And between those two things, obviously it exacerbates displacement pressures across the city. And real briefly, we have a lot of data on housing, but I do think it is important just to touch briefly at a couple points. And 2 things that really kind of illustrate how this issue has kind of changed in Seattle. Over the past 10 years, the average cost of a home, even after adjusting for inflation, has doubled. And you can see, again, the Zillow Home Value Index in 2022 dollars has shown that over the last 10 years, it's gone from a cost of a home has gone from about $500,000 to almost $1 million. And this is especially troublesome because Seattle has persistent, long-standing racial disparities in homeownership. Today, the average or Black and African American homeowners, only households, only 23% are owners, whereas it's almost half for non-Hispanic whites. So there's real disparities, and that high cost makes it hard for us to address those. So as we update the growth strategy, there's a lot of goals that we want to keep in mind. And this is by no means a comprehensive list, but one, we're required to plan for a certain amount of growth under the King County Growth Management Planning Council and our regional context. And they require that over 25 years, we need to plan for at least 170,000 jobs and 220,000 people. So that's the minimum we need to require for. Obviously, it shows that we're expecting strong growth in this area in the future. We want to increase housing supply, diversity, and affordability, as well as reducing displacement of both residents and businesses. We want to address the past ongoing harms from housing discrimination and exclusionary zoning, fostering neighborhoods where more people can walk or bike to local shops, services, amenities, leverage investments in transit, especially new light rail stations, and mitigate and address the impacts of climate change and create livable communities. So there's a lot of things that we really need to keep in mind as we start to think about new alternatives. So the city has released 5 alternatives that we're looking for public feedback on. And again, after that feedback, we'll revise those before we actually start analysis. In EIS, you're always required to start with a no action alternative, which would mean maintaining the status quo of focusing most housing and jobs within existing urban centers and urban villages with no change to land use patterns. On the right, for this and all of the concepts, we have kind of an illustrative map, and you can see what this means is that we currently designate urban centers, which are the dark blue, and urban villages, and other areas do not have a designation as a specific place to grow. Most of those areas, of course, are neighborhood residential zoning, but there are other mixed use and neighborhood commercial zones in those areas as well. So again, the no action would mean that most housing would continue to be primarily rental apartments concentrated in these existing mixed-use areas, and most land outside urban villages would remain limited to high-cost attached homes. This action alternative is proposed to meet that kind of minimum that we're required to plan for, which is, as I talked about, translating those 25-year goals to 20-year goals, and means that we would assume that this scenario assumes about 80,000 new homes and 132,000 new jobs over 20 years. Before I move on to the action alternatives, which are the next 4 alternatives, I want to point out that, again, these are concepts we're looking for feedback on. The no action alternative is the only one that currently has a specific number of homes or jobs that are expected. As we produce final alternatives, we're going to need to get numbers for each of those. Each of the action alternatives that we're going to talk about build on this existing urban village strategy by continuing to allow a lot of growth in those areas that we've already designated that have a lot of shops and services, access to transit, but consider ways we could add new options for housing. Also, all of the action alternatives focus primarily on housing. We're not expecting any of them will create new Amazons or entire new industry sectors, but all of the action alternatives do expect some increase in jobs due to the increase in housing in the city, but it posit different kind of approaches to the distribution and amount of that. So moving on from the no action alternative, I'm going to move into the 4 action alternatives. The first of those is called focused, and it would create additional areas of focused growth, including new urban villages, expanded urban villages, and potentially new smaller nodes that might function like existing urban villages, but maybe at a smaller size and at less intensity. On the right, you can see it's a similar map to the first one, to the no action alternative, except there's a new urban village, an expanded urban village, and these smaller nodes, which are shown in light blue. This concept is designed to create more opportunities for people to grow complete neighborhoods or 15-minute neighborhoods where people can walk to everyday needs. It would create a greater range of housing options, but those would be primarily still rental apartments because it would be in focused areas that would probably allow kind of higher height limits. And it would have a slight increase in at-home and commercial business due to the larger number of people living in Seattle. Concept 3 is broad. It would allow a wider range of low-scale housing options like triplexes and fourplexes in all neighborhood residential zones. And you can see on the right that is shown as a kind of broad change, shown in the light purple. Obviously, there are areas outside of urban centers, villages that already have zoning other than neighborhood residential. But for illustration, it's just kind of shown this broad change to neighborhood residential zones across the city. This concept would expand housing choices, but primarily home ownership options in all neighborhoods. Again, we don't see a lot of home ownership options in the denser zones because condos are not very feasible in a lot of those areas. So this would create a lot more home ownership options, especially new kinds of options that we don't see much of in today in the city, which are maybe less dense than townhouses, but are more affordable than detached homes on large lots. It would also address the exclusionary nature of our current zoning by allowing a wider range of housing options in all neighborhoods. And it would allow more housing options near existing large parks and other neighborhood amenities. This would also have kind of a slight increase in at-home and commercial businesses, but probably spread out through a greater range of the city than in the no action, or sorry, in the last one. Concept 4 is called corridors. It would allow a wider range of low-scale housing options, but only in areas near frequent transit and amenities. And these areas would probably continue to allow options like triplexes and fourplexes, as we talked about in concept 3, but it might also allow some slightly denser forms of housing, such as townhouses or small apartments. And this is really designed to expand the diversity of housing options near transit and amenities. It would also have a slight increase in at-home and commercial businesses, but focus primarily on those corridors. And again, on the right, you can see the existing urban centers and villages from the no action, but then the creation of these corridors in the kind of darker purple. The final alternative is called combined. It would accommodate a greater supply and diversity of housing across Seattle. So again, this would have the highest amount of jobs and housing production of all the alternatives. The distribution of that housing would combine alternatives 2, 3, and 4, resulting in more opportunities overall. You can see on the map on the right, it is that combination of new urban center villages, expanded urban villages, new nodes, broad changes to neighborhood residential, as well as changes along corridors. This would be designed to promote abundant rental and ownership housing, primarily in areas that are well served by transit. And it would address the past underproduction of housing and rising housing costs as well as completing more complete neighborhoods across the city. So you can see that one of the ideas of these, so this is the last of the concepts. One of the ideas is that they posit alternative 2 is a very focused distribution of growth. Alternative 3 is a much more broad, and alternative 5 is just a higher level. And between those things, it would allow us to look at a kind of a wide range of possibilities to give the sense of what might happen under different scenarios. I also want to point out that these alternatives will also have additional detail in the area of the 130th and 145th station areas. There's been significant work in the past, and so there's a lot of potential for being more detailed up front in those areas. And so the alternatives that we're talking about today would have additional detail around 3 specific alternatives in those areas. One, again, would be a no action alternative. One would be creating new nodes and corridors in these areas with heights up to 80 feet. And another would be creating a urban village at 130th and nodes and corridors in other areas, which might include heights as much as 95 feet in around the 130th light rail station. And so these basically are kind of increasing levels of potential change in those areas. I also want to take a minute to touch a little bit on displacement. We know we can't address displacement without increasing housing supply. At the same time, increasing housing supply is on its own insufficient for addressing displacement. As we move towards crafting more detailed alternatives, which again would be released in October, and based on the feedback we hear today and through this process, we will craft all of our action alternatives to consider higher levels of growth in areas of low displacement risk while still increasing housing choice in high displacement risk areas. As part of our work on mandatory housing affordability, we did a lot of work looking at the impacts of growth on displacement, and we found that actually areas that did grow actually did a better job of retaining low-income people as well as people of color, even after removing the income restricted housing in that area. So we want to make sure to continue to increase housing choice across all our neighborhoods, but especially focusing it in low displacement risk areas so that the rate of change in high displacement risk areas is not as overwhelming. The EIS will also evaluate each of the alternatives for its potential impacts on displacement, and the plan itself will have measures to address displacement beyond the growth strategy. As we move from these draft concepts to final ones, we're going to need to actually start to put the location of specific potential nodes or corridors or urban villages on the map. And so we're also looking for feedback on where those should be. an initial list of ideas that we have for places where we might want to kind of focus those nodes or other areas of change would be including around access to frequent transit, especially light rail stations, places where there's access to shops and services or existing and potential amenities like parks, libraries, community centers, and schools. Places, obviously factoring in displacement risk and equity considerations that we've talked, but also thinking about those areas that might be less appropriate for growth, such as environmentally sensitive areas, areas where there's lower levels of walkability or safety or presence of sidewalks, places with air and noise pollution sources, or potential geographic barriers. So the next step on all this work is that we released the initial concepts on June 23rd and began the EIS scoping process. It runs through July 25th, and we're really looking for feedback on the topics, the draft alternatives, or any other things that you want to talk about, how we should go about doing this in our analysis. We're then going to look at that feedback and refine the alternatives for analysis in October and September, and release a scoping report with the final alternatives in October. We'll then commence doing the analysis of the proposal and the alternatives with the idea of having a draft EIS in April of 2023, at the same time we release a draft plan. Then we would have we have the EIS comment, draft EIS comment period, and begin work on the final EIS, which would, again, be updated based on what we heard in terms of comments, but also would include a preferred growth alternative and analysis of that. And then that would culminate in the release of a final EIS in April of 2024. At the same time, we release the mayor's recommended plan and the draft zoning legislation. So there's a number of ways to comment on the EIS scoping period. One is our engagement hub, which is available at engage.oneseattleplan.com. You can also email me directly with EIS comment in the subject line, or you can mail me as well. Again, the comment period goes through July 25th, and we're really interested in your feedback. Specifically, we're interested in what are the issues and topics that should be studied as part of the EIS, what analysis is needed to address environmental impacts and community concerns and priorities, and are the proposed alternatives the right ones to study, or should they be modified? Again, at this stage, we're not specifically focused on which of the alternatives is your favorite, although obviously we're happy to hear any comments you have, but we especially want to know, are these the right ones to study, and how should we go about studying them? So with that, that concludes the presentation. So we're going to go on to the Q&A session. So please, if you have any questions, please do put them in the Q&A, and we will talk through them. And we're going to try and answer all the questions today. If there are more, we can always talk, and feel free to email me after this meeting if you want to have additional questions come up at any time.
Brennan, we have 2 questions in the Q&A right now, and there's a third that I think we're trying to move over there.
Okay.
The first one is basically, why did the city decide on a 30-day comment period for scoping instead of a 45-day comment period, given that it's falling over the summer and the July 4th holiday? So I'll let you get to that one, and then we'll bring up the next one.
Great. So the required period is for an EIS scoping period is 21 days. We decided to extend that a little bit longer to 30 days to allow more time. But certainly, if we're open to suggestions about whether it should be extended farther.
All right, the next one, and obviously if people have follow-up on these, you should email Brennan or send him a letter, but we're just gonna address them here for now. So next one is if there are any EIS related studies for combinations of land use and transportation changes that get done in this process.
Yeah, I think that so there's the EIS analysis, and then there is beyond that also things that we are going to be doing as a city. in terms of the EI analysis, we want to focus on looking at the alternatives themselves and how it's important. The EIS process is about looking at the alternatives and how they vary. And so for this process, we're going to be holding transportation constant, similar to the transportation is doing as part of their EIS. However, obviously, as we start with the kind of broad range of alternatives, we're going to be narrowing those into preferred alternatives. So at that stage, we're going to be looking at kind of more specific ones, so you can understand how a change to a transportation might also impact the proposed change to transportation might also intersect with the proposed change to land use. But then I think probably that this more has to do with things that are outside the EIS. Obviously, we're working very closely with SDOT as they update their STP, the Seattle Transportation Plan, at the same time we update our comp plan. And so we're going to be doing a lot of kind of our own analysis to look at those potential combinations internally. But that is, yeah, I'll stop there.
Brennan, if I could, this is Michael Hubner, if I could jump in and just build on that briefly, which is, just to be clear, each of the alternatives that we'll be studying in the draft EIS will be analyzed with respect to potential travel and transportation needs. That we anticipate those will be different across the alternatives. We will be identifying potential mitigation measures, which would constitute transportation investments or services or other approaches to meet the needs of people to be able to move about the city in any of these land use alternatives. That's something we'll be studying individually in going through the CIS process.
All right. Next question is, how are the mayor's recommended plan and the preferred alternative reconciled?
Yeah, so the idea is that the preferred alternative should be the same as what is in the recommended plan. So that's the reason why the mayor's recommended plan and the final EIS would come out at the same time, is that they're meant to be aligned in terms of kind of a single vision for what we are proposing moving forward.
Okay. Next question: if new alternatives that would be right to study is proposed, would OPCD consider it for analysis? And then kind of a question that's similar to that. Just to clarify, at this point, we're looking for feedback on whether these are the right set of alternatives to look at, and basically whether there are any missing options, if any option is not worth studying, or if any need to be adjusted prior to the study. So the question is that kind of the right place to focus feedback? And if there's a new alternative that somebody would like to propose, would the city consider that?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so that is the purpose of the scoping period, is to get feedback, amongst other things, on are these the right alternatives? Are there additional alternatives that should be studied? Are there alternatives that don't need to be studied? Should these alternatives be modified? I think those are all things that we're looking for feedback at this point, and so we would appreciate any comments about what you think those are. And obviously, we would, of course, that's the purpose of it, so we definitely would consider it.
Brennan, this is Michael again. If I could again briefly add here, one thing to keep in mind is that the purpose of identifying the alternatives for study in the draft EIS is to inform a decision-making process for that final preferred alternative. And as such, they are deliberately crafted to be distinct and to enable us to study trade-offs in very different approaches. Corridors versus nodes, more growth versus less growth. You may have ideas that are combinations of different approaches, and the intent here is not that the city would choose from among the alternatives you see, but use the information from the analysis to craft a preferred. So it likely could very well be a hybrid of different approaches. Just wanted to make sure that it was well understood that these 4 action alternatives do not constrain what the final preferred alternative could look like, but they set the bookends within which that final preferred alternative would need to be designed to make sure we've analyzed all of the impacts in this draft EIS.
All right, there are a few questions about what kind of impacts we'll be looking at in the EIS. So one wondering if the EIS is going to study the impacts of anti-displacement policies and strategies that are not growth strategies. Another around GHG emissions, and I believe, let's go with those 2 actually to start, and then I'll add the others on.
Great. Yeah, I think there's one about trees too, so I'll add that on as well.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so in terms of the types of impacts, I think that we had that slide on the topics to be analyzed. So there's a really wide range of impacts that we're going to be looking at. Starting with displacement. Yes, displacement is something that we're going to be really doing a lot of extra work to look at. And again, all the analyzing each of the alternatives and the final proposal against their potential impact for displacement is critically important, but also that the policies themselves that would be proposed as part of the comp plan as part of that as well. The draft EIS is going to look more at the impact really on alternatives specifically, because we're still developing what those policies are for displacement. The final EIS would though definitely not only look at the growth strategy, but also the policies and proposals that are purported to be included in the comp plan as well. And I will say that, in terms of the displacement analysis, we are definitely going to be looking at past trends on demolition to understand what is being demolished as we've grown in the past. We also have a development capacity model that will help us look at that kind of at a fine grade level of where development might be and the amount of displacement that would occur as well. We also want to look at economic displacement, the kind of much broader trend of how housing prices are affecting displacement and how this would influence housing prices. And then lastly, we also, in addition to residential displacement, want to look at kind of commercial displacement, how it's affecting businesses and institutions as well. And obviously there would be policies that would address those different types of displacement in the final plan as well. The other one was about greenhouse gas. We are going to be looking at the impact of all the alternatives and the final proposal on greenhouse gas emissions from a variety of sources, from transportation, as well as buildings, both the energy use in buildings for heating and hot water, but also from waste, like solid waste as well. We're going to be conducting a transportation model that's going to look very specifically at where the types of trips that will be taken, car, transit, bus, walking, and where they'll be from and to, so that we'll have a really detailed understanding of those trips, and then we can use that to, in particular, look at the climate change and air pollution impacts of those trips. Lastly, I know there's one about trees, and so we have been, as a city, been working on putting together a new canopy cover assessment. We're actually doing LiDAR as well as we're sort of combining LiDAR data as well as visual data to understand our canopy cover, and we can compare that today to what happened during the last analysis, which I believe is 2016. We're going to be doing a lot of analysis to look at what that meant for different areas of the city, as well as lots that had development permits and which didn't. And so then we're going to use that data to help project future trends across the alternatives in the final proposal.
All right, we have another set of questions kind of around how the specific considerations will be weighted against one another or prioritized when choosing between alternatives. And then who ultimately decides which plan gets chosen, whether that's the mayor, city council, or OPCD.
Yeah. So a couple things, just in terms of the alternatives. Again, the purpose of alternatives is to provide data about different potential different scenarios that could happen. We are not proposing that we have to choose from those options. Again, they're actually purposely meant to be very distinct, so you can understand what the impacts of different changes are. Generally, a final proposal is always a combination of different things that borrow from different things. So I guess I want to stress that, the purpose of the alternatives is not to put forward a menu of options that have to be chosen from, but rather just to help inform data. And so, overall, there won't really be a process of choosing between them, but rather a process of creating the scenario, the preferred scenario that we really want to see as a city. Ultimately, that decision will be made by the elected officials, mayor and council, but it's going to be crafted through a process of kind of reiterative putting out proposals, doing public engagement, putting out new proposals, and to help create something that then can be put forth to the mayor. The mayor would then recommend to council, and then council will modify and adopt. And I think, especially the key things on that process is, creating a draft plan that would come out in April of 2023. That at that time we'd also have probably some design concepts that show what housing might be allowed in different areas. We'll get feedback on that. We'll also then be doing some economic analysis to look at that, and then we'll actually be having another round of comments on specific maps that show where might these places be. And so the idea is kind of trying to get starting at a high level of kind of goals and policies, and then a kind of a draft proposal to specific proposal, and having kind of continuous engagement throughout that to help refine that proposal. I think there's also maybe a question about the criteria, like where might, as we look for criteria about where might these nodes or urban villages be, that's something we don't have a proposed criteria for how those would be beyond those kind of that list of things that we are talking about. So I think that's something we're looking for feedback on. Is that list the right list of things that we should be considering, and how should we balance those in creating proposals that actually start to say where might nodes or urban villages be located.
All right, I just want to make sure I don't miss this one in the chat that I don't think got pulled over. So there's many older small footprint homes within or adjacent to urban villages that are on the single family 5,000 lots. And the comment states that the RSL M zoning seems to allow these lots to be split for 2 detached homes, or basically allowing for an increase in home ownership and helping to mitigate climate change because they can offer more green space than apartments or condos. And they're wondering if any of the alternatives include RSL M zoning.
Yeah, so first of all, for people who don't know, RSL is residential small lot. It allows a kind of a massing, or sorry, a total square footage of building that's not that much different from other neighborhood residential zones, but allows more density, basically 1 unit per 2,000 square feet of lot. So on the average single, neighborhood residential lot, that means you can generally split to about 2 or maybe 3 units. So first, so the alternative 3 and 4, the broad and the corridors, posits allowing additional new housing types in some neighborhood residential areas like duplexes and triplexes. At this level, it is not specifically saying how that compares to the residential small lot zone, but certainly will allow some housing types that are similar to the housing types we see in residential small lot. Other ones posit other changes like nodes or corridors, which might allow some wider variety of zones, and you might So again, at this point, like none of the alternatives have specific zoning proposals associated with them, or but it's very possible that RSL zoning or something like that might occur in places like the corridors. It could also occur at the edges of urban villages if they're new ones or new nodes. So those are all possibilities. But again, I think at this point, we're looking for feedback on where those type of opportunities should be located rather than having a specific proposal.
Okay, next question. For large lots with a small single family home that are adjacent to a stream or a wetland, will multi-unit replacement be able to expand closer to the critical area, or will there be a process such as a variance to expand?
Yeah, I think that is a question that is probably more detailed than what we're really envisioning at the alternative stage. That is kind of a question that's going to be answered through the larger comprehensive plan process about, as we get more detail about the details of where should this be located. I'm certainly none of the alternatives are proposing to get rid of the basic requirements of environmentally critical areas and shoreline master program. And I think, as we talked about those locational criteria, one of those things that we're definitely going to want to think about is what are the areas where maybe development is less appropriate, and certainly wetlands, streams are on that list of things that we as a city feel are, places where we want less development. So I think none of these alternatives are detailed enough that it's going to get into those topics. That's a conversation we're going to want to have, and we obviously want to get feedback on. But yes, but considering the importance of those areas is clearly part of what we need to do as part of this work.
Okay. Next question is, will all alternatives be configured to meet the growth targets?
Yeah, so right now there are growth targets as part of the last comprehensive plan update. As part of this comprehensive plan, we're going to have to update and create new growth targets. So at this point, there are no growth targets that we have created for this plan. There are, however, minimum amounts of jobs and housing that we have to plan for through our regional framework that have been, which comes through the King County Growth Management Planning Council. The alternative one, which is the no action one, is intended to accommodate a number of jobs and housing that's equal to that minimum. And so then all of the alternatives would assume a greater level of jobs and housing beyond that minimum. And then setting growth targets for the city and for specific urban centers and villages is something that will come later in this process.
Brendan, if I could jump in, I just want to make
Please.
sure, just for clarity on what we're naming things here. It sounds like the questioner is may be indeed familiar with the Growth Management Planning Council and the growth targets that are adopted under our countywide planning policies. And Brendan talked about those during his presentation. That no action alternative is designed to accommodate that minimal number, and these targets are the minimum. The other alternatives will have more growth. Those are so there's a simple answer here, which is yes, all the alternatives will accommodate our countywide targets. In our current plan, we don't talk about targets per se, but rather growth estimates, which were based in our current plan on the targets that were in place in 2016 when we adopted that plan. And in this plan, we may indeed use the same nomenclature and talk about growth estimates, but just on the targets issue, the countywide targets, we are seeking to accommodate them and look at options that are greater than that, especially because we know there has been a tremendous amount of pressure on the housing market from our job growth, from our location within the region, and the desirability of the city. We need to look at options that really go above and beyond the targets.
Yeah, and also again, as the draft alternatives we have today, only the no action posits a specific number of jobs and housing. as we move towards creating final alternatives that we actually analyze, we will actually need to assign, specific numbers to each of those. And that, again, what those numbers should be is something that we are looking for feedback on, or how we should go about creating them. Both things we're looking for feedback on.
Another question about the alternatives, whether option 2 looks at making the whole city a 15-minute city or only a small number of new nodes.
Yeah, that's a great question. And yet, so for people who aren't familiar, the 15-minute neighborhoods are neighborhoods where you can walk within 15 minutes, or sometimes people are considering biking within 15 minutes to get your everyday needs. It is kind of a concept that came out of I think Paris, and what people often think about is an area where it's very easy to walk to all your needs. There's no one standard for what a 15-minute neighborhood is, or how you measure it. Obviously, even there's a lot of disagreement on what everyday needs means, whether it's just grocery stores or if it's also like medical facilities. So I think that we see that as kind of as a goal that we're trying to aspire to, but not as a kind of a fine line that these things make our 15-minute neighborhood, or these things are a 15-minute neighborhood. So I think the goal is to make more of the city the kind of place that is a 15-minute neighborhood. But I don't think we feel that one of them would only do that in specific areas, or one would do it in a or in the entire city, because it's hard to define exactly what that means in practice in a place. But I think so. The goal is different alternatives would do that to a different degree. The nodes would kind of make specific areas more like 15-minute neighborhoods, whereas some of the other ones like broad or corridors or the combined might do it over a greater area of the city. So it's more, it's more about whether those changes are focused or kind of done more broadly.
And Brendan, I want to add just one detail to that, especially considering the focused alternative with the nodes versus corridors or the broad. It's not just a question of the geographic extent of the services and amenities that would be available to households across the city, but also what the concentrations in the node option, for example, in the focused alternative. It's very likely, we would assume, that there would be a variety of goods and services available in one place, a richer mix, and providing more housing choice nearby those areas, as well as to existing residences near those nodes. In more spread out versions like broad or even in the corridors, it would be much more spread out. And so that the access, there are trade-offs among the alternatives as far as access for people across the city or in specific neighborhoods. And that's something we'll be studying through this update. There are different approaches to achieve that 15-minute neighborhood concept. And it's not just, is it citywide or not, but also what do people have access to? We'll also be listening to community and seeking feedback from community about what their communities need. What are the daily goods and services that they need? What are the culturally appropriate, the gaps? And really with an eye toward the equity goal that we have for this overall effort.
Okay, we have a few more questions here. One is whether the EIS process allows for any opportunity to study how streamlining the permitting and land use approval process might positively impact housing supply and climate goals.
Yeah, the EIS process. So obviously the alternatives don't look at that level of detail, and I do think as part of the comprehensive plan process, there's an opportunity for looking at different approaches to policy and goals that could support that, and to the extent that that becomes kind of a proposal. So one, those things could be mitigating measures to help address unaffordability. They also are things that could be as part of the comp plan proposal itself, and thus would be analyzed as part of the EIS. However, I will say that that is a level of detail that EISs are not generally very good at providing much information about. With that said, I think there's a lot of work that's going on in the city on that, which is probably more important. The mayor put together a housing sub cabinet that is specifically looking at a wide variety of things around housing, including specifically looking at the permitting process and how to make it less of a barrier to new housing, more quicker, more predictable. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities on that kind of outside of the EIS process.
Brendan, would you mind if I added one point on that?
Please.
The 130th and 145th areas that are getting a little closer look, that's based on a grant agreement with the Department of Commerce. One aspect of that is to look at facilitating future environmental review. So from that angle, there may be some lessons from that analysis that could be applied elsewhere.
Great point.
Okay, we have another question around access to opportunity and how that's being factored in. So obviously displacement risk is informing the scope of the EIS, but after reading through the various materials in the engagement hub, the commenter isn't sure if access to opportunity is a less significant factor in determining future housing growth.
Yeah, so I'll start by saying, as part of the last comprehensive plan update, we did a lot of analysis and put forward a document called the Growth and Equity Analysis. It looked at basically two things: one, displacement risk throughout the city, and then what they called access to opportunity, which is to what extent are areas near transit, schools, parks, all those aspects that make it neighborhoods, but both kind of allow access to jobs in terms of education and transit, but also make places look very livable. And so we're considering updating that. We've already updated the displacement risk half of it, and are considering ways to just update the access to opportunity. With that said, I think in my mind, some of those core aspects of access to opportunity are transit, access to shops and services, access to park, schools, community centers, and those are kind of core things that we would think should be considered as we think about the location of urban centers, nodes, and villages as we move forward. So I think those are definitely those aspects of it are something that we would definitely want to consider as we think about the location of areas of change. And obviously the comp plan will also think about how to create more of those things, transit and shops and services, et cetera, both in those areas where we're growing and across the city. So I think that is an important part of it. Certainly we're looking for feedback on, how do we weigh those factors, what the ones are, how do people, what are those needs that people want to be able to access near their house. I think those are also, so we're both planning on looking at it, but we're also looking for feedback on, what that means to you and how we should recognize it.
Okay, last question here. Oh, remember, with one more pop in, but you kind of answered this already, but will all the alternatives factor in the current canopy goal of 30% across the city and in individual zones? Yeah,
so there's the city has a goal of trying to achieve 30% canopy cover by 2035. And that will certainly be, something that will be as we analyze tree canopy cover in all the alternatives. That's something we'll certainly be comparing them to.
Okay, and last one here, a question from social media. Why weren't options for adding more housing that are bolder than alternative 5 proposed?
Well, I guess first I'll say, these are the types of things that we're looking for feedback on. I think we tried to create these draft alternatives so that they represent kind of a wide range of options and things that are, kind of maybe are pretty big departures from what today, but are maybe kind of practically things that we could see a lot of people agreeing on. So I think, our goal was to kind of create a wide variety of options, and as we move forward on Combinate, we're very interested in things about whether we missed the mark on getting that right range of things.
Okay, and I don't see any other in the question and answer section.
Great. So thank you all very much for coming to this meeting and listening and asking questions. I just want to leave off again that we are very interested in hearing comments from you about, again, the topics we're proposing covered, how we're proposing to go across analysis, are the alternatives we're considering the right ones, and what things we should keep in mind as we actually start to think about how we might locate those nodes and urban centers and corridors on a map. So please do take some time to think about it and comment. Again, that commenting period is open until July 25th. We do have another of these scoping meetings on July 19th. If you think this has been helpful, please consider telling that to other people. The content of those meetings will be exactly the same as this. So you're obviously welcome to attend both of them, but the content's gonna be the same. We are also going to post a video of this online. So if you want to refer back to it, if there's other people that you think would want to look at, that will be a resource as well. So thank you all very much for coming. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to hearing your comments and talking more as we move forward. Michael, do you have any final thoughts?
I also just wanted to echo the many thanks for the interest and the great questions, and and making time out of your busy days to be here and hear about the plan and provide comments today. In addition to the video of this meeting, I think we'll just want to point out, if you go to our project website or the engagement hub that Brennan provided you links to, there is also other material there. There is a fact sheet. There is a story map tool that and other materials that are background to the alternatives, and also describe the alternatives. So there's multiple ways to go back and learn about, to spread the word to others who are not here today about what we are talking about studying in the EIS. And please contact us if you have any additional questions during this period as well.
And also just lastly, just reminded that there will also be a meeting specific to the 130th and 145th stations on July 21st, if you're interested in that specific area. Well, thank you very much for the time. I appreciate it, and look forward to hearing your comments.